It used to be like the rule of thumb was you don't change your fundamental pricing model more than once every 5 years. Agentforce, like literally Salesforce, one of the biggest companies in the world, changes fundamental pricing structure 3 times in the past 12 months. Now, that's insane to me. Like, I don't know how they retrain their sales team, and maybe it's going well, maybe it's not. But the point is that some of the largest companies in the world are moving at historical speeds. And so if you're the one sitting there, startups on the one hand are kind of like cannibalizing or rewriting your market, and you're sitting on a pricing change that you're gonna sit and you're gonna do a 9-month case study and then roll it out after 6 to 9 months, you're gonna be like a year and a half behind. And by the time you even go live, your pricing model is gonna be outmoded. Really, the kind of genesis of what we're doing, the way we think about it is like monetization infrastructure. So kind of take all the process of how a company generates value and captures it and turn it into software infrastructure. That's like ultimately what Metronome is all about. And if you're trying to think about it in terms of technology, it's roughly like Datadog plus a billing engine is like what we literally do. Metronome actually starts from my time at Dropbox. So I worked there from 2013 to 2019, and I was in charge of essentially the engineering part of monetization, what we basically called monetization growth. So our job was to kind of do the pricing and packaging, build the front-end experiences, launch new SKUs and add-ons. And our goal at the end of the day was to drive revenue growth of the business. So that experience really taught me the power of essentially monetization, pricing, and packaging, and helping grow a business. But there were kind of 3 challenges that my team ran into. So the first was we would go do like a pricing experiment. Like, let's go try to charge this set of users this different price. Like instead of charging them $9.99, let's call them $11.99. Those pricing experiments would basically require someone to go write code in the billing system. And frequently, because that code was so fragile, it would take anywhere from a quarter to 2 quarters to get that pricing change live into production, which was insane because we could do the front end work in like a day. And so the cycle time of the experiment was like months. The second challenge we ran into was that we would do that change and then customers would get really confused. And the kind of root problem there was our billing system was essentially a script that ran once a month, once a quarter, depending on the billing cycle. But customers were in the product every single day. They're looking at the price. They're looking at how much they're going to pay. And because, again, the bills were only computed like once every full moon, that meant that customers only got information out of the billing system like once a month. And so they'd find out about pricing changes after they'd already paid for the new price. So there's like this really challenging like customer experience problem. And that really taught me that billing was really honestly more of a product surface than a once a month workflow. And then the third problem we ran into at Dropbox was we were customers of the billing system, but the data that came out of the billing system, basically we didn't have access to. It kind of, we'd write invoices, we'd get paid or not get paid, they do these like collections processes, and then eventually it'd flow into a general ledger, and then like some business analyst would do some work and they'd tell us, oh, by the way, you made the company $6 million last quarter or something like that. That lag time of like experimental learning, it's like if you've ever worked in growth, is like anathema. Basically what it was saying is that our learning loop was roughly 2 quarters. That's way too slow for a business. And so I wanted to build a system that was fundamentally like meant to solve the monetization problem. And that's like kind of been our animating kind of drive for the past 5 years.
Is there an inflection point that caused you to do this? Has this been like some long outstanding problem that just nobody decided to solve, or is there some change that caused you to kind of come out, start a company around usage-based billing?
I think billing is one of those, if you like talk to people who've worked at companies, billing is always like where engineer careers go to die. Like, and so if you ask why, it's like fundamentally every company prices and packages subtly differently. And what that means is that like the person who's in charge of encoding that pricing and packaging, their job is essentially to kind of hard code a bunch of business rules that are specific to this company at this point in time. And they're doing it under the gun always. Like at Dropbox, for instance, our billing system was built by interns every summer. Like it would get updated every summer because the only people we could convince to work on it were like interns. And what that means is like
it's so boring.
Exactly, so boring. And it's like, if I could optimize the sync engine or I could go work on billing, I'm going to choose to work on the sync engine 100% of the time. And so what happens is it kind of leads to this like steady accumulation of technical debt, and it just becomes this giant rat nest. When you're on seat subscriptions, like, it's actually not that hard to do billing. It's like, okay, how many users do I have? Okay, like let's do a count on the user table and then multiply by the price. Okay, relatively simple. Now, there's a lot of complexity in there. It's still like, it's kind of annoying, but it's not that hard. In usage, it's like now you're like, okay, we have 1 trillion queries on ChatGPT, and what we're doing is we're pricing per token, but if it's like above this token amount, it's priced totally differently. And so actually now the complexity of the problem of generating the invoice isn't like counting on a user table that has like 1 million rows in it. It's like join across these 50 different data sources and this super complex pricing structures. And so usage billing was the thing that kind of triggered us to be interested, because fundamentally it's a data infra problem married to the same billing complexity part, but it's that data infra that actually made it worth solving and caused me to be like, okay, actually this is a problem big enough to go solve. And actually if we solve it, it's actually more valuable than the prior generation.
I think it's actually worth going through a bit of the history here. So I sit on a bunch of boards of AI companies. They're all trying to think about how to do usage-based billing. Like that book hasn't really been written yet, but we've seen big pricing changes in the past. So when I did my company, perpetual was the thing. So you didn't even have recurring, right? You didn't have per seat. So you'd sell $300 million and it's just perpetual and people get to use it forever or whatever it is. And then that went into recurring or seat-based, which gave rise to companies like Zora, and now we're seeing the inflection. So maybe you can walk a little bit through kind of this in relation to those shifts.
Yeah, so the way that I think about it, there's really 3 eras of monetization. You're talking about, there's the on-prem era where it's like perpetual licenses, then the cloud era, which was seat subscription, and now I would call the AI era or the value era. I think the key thing that I now understand, again, I didn't understand this 5 years ago, but it's kind of become clear now, is that what's actually happening is in the late 90s, the move to the cloud actually created the conditions for seats and subscriptions. So basically, when you move from the value of your software in the on-prem era is you literally buy software, you install it, maybe you pay a maintenance fee, someone comes and updates it, physically every year or something like that. The value is the software and what it does. It's just it's like you pay a flat price. Okay. In the cloud era, now everything is the value of the software shifts. Instead of this software living on-prem, it's now who in my org has access to a common repository set of data. So in Salesforce's case, it's how many sales reps have access to the common shared system of record for our sales deals and our sales pipeline. So the value of the software scales as your org scales. And you can try to do things like make the software more valuable for individual users, but roughly the kind of value metric is how many people have access to it. Now what's happening in AI is actually fundamentally something different, which is AI is changing the value prop of software. It's kind of doing 2 things at once. One, it's like the software is not doing work on your behalf. And so the core value of the software is not who in my org has access to the data. It's what can this software do for me? Can it write code for me? Can it defer tickets or something in a customer support use case? So AI is doing work. And then the second thing that's happening is, if you follow that line of thinking, also the number of people who have access to that system is shrinking because you're able to get efficiency gains. And so so what's happening is for these SaaS businesses, their core metric before was number of people. That's kind of trending down. Maybe it's staying flat. And then at the same time, the value is now the work that the software is doing on my behalf, which doesn't monetize in the scaling with users way. And so fundamentally, that's what's happening in this moment. And so because the value is changing, it's opening the door for a new commercial model.
Okay, so I think you've already partially just answered what I'm going to ask, but I just think it's worth to call out. So the idea of usage-based billing isn't new. It's been around for a long time in infrastructure. And the adage was simple, which is if you have an app, you do per seat.
Yep.
And if you have infrastructure, you do consumption, and that's because it's tied to a computer science resource like storage or whatever. Is that still true, or is that what's being changed? And based on what you just said, it seems like it's changing.
Yeah, it's definitely changing. I think the way I always like to think about it is software, everyone talks about, are you pricing to value? And I think that's kind of what's coming to the fore. So what I actually see happening in a lot of these SaaS businesses is what I would call the rise of hybrid business models, where you have a per user fee, and then you also have variable costs. And so I think what that does is it does a bunch of different things. One, it very much feels like almost like a bridge commercial technology. It's like moving to pure consumption is actually kind of a challenging thing to do because seats and subscriptions is really simple and easy to understand. Usage is not nearly as simple, and it's much harder to predict for good reasons. It's like, you don't know how much value you're going to get. If I get more value, I pay more, but that predictability hurts like a lot of companies. And so they like to have this like bridge model of seats and users kind of almost serve like a platform fee and like an anchor point, it's like our minimum of our revenue. And then you have this upside capture in the value case. And so what we're seeing a lot in SaaS, like big established SaaS players, like Salesforce, for instance, they went and like added this Agentforce stuff. They still have per user access fees, but now the Agentforce is this variable cost on top that allows them to, like, if the agents actually are providing value, now my business will scale as you get more value from it, even if you don't increase headcount.
Drawing from my own experience building infrastructure software, we decided to do some usage-based billing. We thought it was going to be pretty easy to do. We actually had like the top, I would say, of the time distributed systems team, and we couldn't do it. It just turned out to be really hard. And I can't tell you how often I hear this story play out where these really good infrastructure companies want to do usage-based billing and then they can't. And it's just not super obvious. It wasn't obvious to me then, and it's probably not obvious to a lot of people listening on like why it's so hard. So can you maybe give a mental model of why this stuff is so difficult to build?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are interesting to think about. So the first is that when you're doing usage, I think there's this key thing that happens. So you're an engineer, you're consuming cloud infrastructure. As soon as you turn on that machine, you kind of have started this meter, and it's like starting to spin and it's starting to like accrue money. The challenge with that is, especially with a lot of these AI tools, is that meter can grow very, very fast. You can spend, like I always like to say, like if I wanted to, I could go spend $1 million on OpenAI in like 3 hours if I wanted to on the API. And so what that means is that because you can theoretically have unbounded amount of spend in very short periods of time, you aren't just like doing counting statistics over that usage at some monthly time scale. It actually needs to approach like a real-time problem. And so the first reason it's hard is because actually if you think about usage billing as this like unbounded spend problem, you need to have like a near real-time system that can detect when you're, like have a rogue process that's like consuming a bunch of money. It's like a good example is we talked to Segment 5 years ago, and they were one of the first pioneers of this stuff. And they had some small startup in India with like $3,000 in their account. They turned on Segment, and then they sent them a bill at the end of the month for $80,000. And that was because someone on the team accidentally hooked up their CDP to their entire traffic pattern. And so Segment didn't collect on that, but that's like $80,000 of breakage that they're never going to get back. And so what it means is that the billing system can't be thought of as this like once a month process, which is kind of the natural thing. It's like solving the billing problem accurately if you don't have a time constraint actually is kind of a simple problem as long as you have high quality data, but solving it in real time makes it really hard. I think the second thing that's really important is, especially in this age right now, is that your pricing model looks static because you publish it on a web page, but in most cases, it's highly dynamic, and you've worked in enterprise sales. Every sales deal looks slightly different. And so handling the complexity of all those edge cases is really, really challenging to do in a general way. And so what ends up happening is, we're talking to a company last week, a public company, they're in like $1 billion in usage-based spend through enterprise contracts. All of that $1 billion is handled by hand. Why is it handled by hand? Because every single enterprise contract is different. It has a different amount of discounts, and it has a different amount of this customer negotiated a discount on this line item and this one on a different one. Creating the general rules engine that can handle all that complexity is really, it's honestly just very boring work and very hard. And so what ends up happening is that company in the early days would choose to build it themselves because it looks simple. They have one contract that looks weird. Flash forward 6 years, and now they have 1,000 contracts that look weird, and now they're all being handled by hand. And so those are the kinds of things that start to break. And then I think the last thing that's just important is, aside from being real time and handling that flexibility, is that the data scale, in truth, what you want to do is you want to preserve optionality on how you price, which means that you need to store a bunch of data, that a lot of which you won't actually use to compute an invoice. But let's say that you want to change pricing in the future. If you haven't stored and retained that data in a financially accurate way, suddenly you're left with really broken data pipelines, and you have data that's accurate to 99% accurate. The problem with that is the 99% accuracy is fraud in a financial sense. And so you actually have to have really golden data pipelines in order to solve this problem especially at public company scale.
One thing that I didn't appreciate was how strategic usage-based billing is to the actual company implementing it. A lot more than say recurring or perpetual or something. It actually becomes part of the business plan. So maybe you can just talk very crisply, let's say someone listening to this podcast is running a business and they're thinking about usage-based business, how you think about that as strategic to the business.
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to think about it is that it kind of goes back to this pricing to value concept. So you are now linking your pricing, your revenue model to the value that you generate. What that means is that the value chain starts with the enterprise seller is selling your software, and it's selling in a value case. Now, that enterprise seller is probably selling a credit buy for $1 million of credits that spend down as the customer starts using your product. Let's say it's a data warehouse or something like that. The sales process is fundamentally very different than in a seat subscription model, where you take $1 million up front and you just kind of recognize the revenue, divide by 12 every month. In a usage world, actually now, that seller doesn't get paid commission until the product is actually used. So now that seller's entire incentive structure...
Assuming you have a reasonable comp.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Which by the way, people get wrong all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that's an exception. Most people just they get the worst of both worlds. They basically pay you out for the $1 million contract, and then they only get to recognize revenue when the usage is accrued. Yeah. So yes,
and by the way, there's the reason I actually interjected, it's just important to realize how much this impacts the business broadly, including things like sales comp, sales behavior, post-sales, customer success.
Exactly right. Well, so I think, and I think the key is, again, it's about how do you generate and capture value, but the value generation starts in the office of the CRO. Then the product has to come and actually fulfill the thing, and the customers have to actually use it and figure out how to use it. That's a success thing. It's a product thing. It's an engineering thing. And then finally, at the end of the month, quarter, whatever, you get to recognize revenue. And so what it means is that usage I think of it very in a pure sense. It's oh, we finally have perfectly aligned incentives with our customers, right? They only pay us when they use it. We only, our sales team is incentivized to not get a user that just gives us a bunch of money and then doesn't use the product. Actually, they're incentivized to find good customers for us. Product is incentivized to build product that actually drives usage. Finance is now able to recognize revenue in a way that corresponds to the value that we create. In a theoretical sense, everything is beautiful. The problem is, we have 30 years of Silicon Valley where various parts of the company were actually not incentivized to put more value into the product. A good example is, again, I love Dropbox. Drew, you're an incredible person. But the commercial model of Dropbox it was a team-based thing, number of users. It incentivized us to get really good at getting a wall-to-wall deployment. Did not incentivize us at all to drive incremental usage. In fact, in a very literal sense, you didn't want people to maximize their usage of quota because the customers at the P99 of usage actually were margin negative. So in fact, your product is actually we want to get you to have 7 files in there, not 7,000. And I think in a usage-based model, it kind of theoretically aligns everyone's incentives toward the same thing. But the problem is that most business units they're fundamentally, that's not how they operate today. And so when you're adopting a usage-based model, I think the way I like to put it to my team is when we're talking to a sales deal, if I can't talk to the CEO of that company, it's not a real deal. Because the CEO has to be I'm going to take the hard path. I'm going to build a company around value creation and capture. And I'm going to make sure that sales is aligned to it. I'm going to make sure that customer support is aligned to it. I'm going to make sure product is, finance, all that stuff. That's a business transformation. That's a big deal. And fundamentally, it's just not how most businesses in Silicon Valley work today. And so when I'm thinking about advising that theoretical company about this, my literal first recommendation is are you ready? Are you gonna commit to it? Because if you're not, then you can't just change your pricing and have it magically work out. You actually have to change all the incentives along the way in order for it to stick.
So what is that punch list for a new CEO that's okay, I'm going to do usage-based billing? What are the top 5 concerns Just to give them a peek at the implications and impact to the company.
Sales and compensation, I think, is number one.
The comp plan for sales.
Comp plan for sales. Then the second thing is the role of sales. So the comp plan, and then also what is the territory? Like, is sales start or end when the contract is signed?
Does it change the roles of like pre-sales and post-sales?
Definitely. A lot of these companies don't even have a distinction between those two roles, or they have a person who's can play both sides, because the pre-sales job is like, honestly, it's mostly like vetting some quick requirements. But if you sell $1 million deal that gets no usage, that's like essentially you've booked fake revenue. And it kind of goes into the second thing. Like, I mean, it's real spend. But if that customer then churns after year one on $0, that's like a hugely negative thing for your business. And then the other nice thing about these businesses, I mean, you know this better than most, is the beauty of usage is that if you can find that true product market fit, it just compounds in a way. It creates this incredible flywheel of value that a seat subscription model can't even touch. And yet it requires that you build every part of your customer journey into that. So one would be sales, comp. Second would be like role of go-to-market team. Do you split the AE role, or do you have like a unified team? I know a lot of companies that kind of just keep the same rep on it for years.
What happens to CS in this case?
It's a good question. I think in a lot of cases, the role of CS is really much thinner than you would otherwise have. I think you really do want a team who's deeply embedded in the success of the company, but most CS folks on the label aren't doing enough to justify that. And the real successful people is actually more of like a technical support rep, SA type of person who's, for instance, we are a consumer of a lot of these like usage-based companies. The best ones, our most valuable person in the entire company is a freaking SA. And frequently it's like a field CTO helping us discover ways of saving us money. Like that person's job in a very real sense is to cause me to spend less money per unit time, because what they know is that if I right size my spend, I'm going to be a much happier customer for much longer.
One trend that I've seen in line with this is like CS teams more and more are starting to get comped or guided towards KPIs that are like gross churn and CSAT as opposed to like an expansion number, for all the reasons that you've said. So like their job is to just make sure that like the customers are using it, the customers are happy, they're not going away, but not necessarily to actually drive the usage specifically, because that's what the sales teams are have to do to align with the comp to the sales.
Exactly right. And so I would like focus on that area. The other two areas that I would focus on if I'm this theoretical CEO with a punch card.
Yep.
First is really make sure your product and engineering team is kind of really deeply understanding what I think of as like the core value metric. At Facebook, you know, they always had like very clear metric alignment, and they use that to drive like really massive things. I think that same growth mindedness you need to bring into your product org, because you need them to be really focused on what the core value metric is for the customer, both so they can communicate it to the customer, but so that as the customer uses the product, it encourages the use of more of that value metric, because ultimately that is now your revenue. Like in a very literal sense, that metric is your revenue. And so actually in a lot of ways, your product team becomes almost like a revenue driving team in a way that in seat subscription, you kind of had enough buffer that you could kind of like be like, okay, product's probably providing value. In these usage-based businesses, it's completely objective, the value that your product team is driving, which I think it favors a very specific type of product manager and product team, but I think you need to be very careful there. And then I think the last thing that I think is really important is, as the CEO, as the entire team, you need to be looking at those core metrics much like a Facebook would. So like in a seat subscription business, you can kind of run your revenue org kind of lazily. We're like, basically not looking at how they're using the product. You're kind of just like evaluating it close to renewal or something like that. In a lot of these true usage businesses, the CEO, the CRO, the entire exec team is looking at core user usage on a weekly basis, sometimes a daily basis. They're obsessing over like, oh, this new workload came online and our largest customer just increased their, the slope of their burn down curve by 2%. What happened? Is that good increase in spend? Is that bad? And you need to understand that. And what that means is that the finance team needs to be almost more of like a strategic data provider and also operate at a totally different clock speed. Like a finance team that's used to working quarterly, monthly is like orders of magnitude too slow for this world. And so what you need to do is you need to like make sure your finance team is ready to essentially become a data org, because they own the source of truth for that usage and spend data at the end of the day. And they need to be able to provide it back to their teams really, really fast and have like complete mastery over it. And if they don't, then what that means is the sales rep is kind of look at like a lagging dashboard of like kind of speculative quality data, and they're not going to be able to do their job. They're not going to be able to go, oh, customer Acme Corp, like, why did you bring on this new workload? Your spend is going to expire in month 8 instead of month 12. Like, is that your intention? Should I be happy about that, or should I be really sad and help you take that workload off? I think that's the kind of thing that your finance team, in a very real sense, has to kind of become that data purveyor. I think they all want to do it, but they're not necessarily equipped to do it.
Do you think all software companies go to usage-based billing, or is there a dividing line that we should be thinking? I'll tell you, I am surprised by how many companies that would traditionally be C companies are going to usage-based billing. So I'm just kind of wondering if there's like a rough rule here.
Yeah. So I think infra layer is like pure usage, and I think that just is the model. I think it just works perfect.
Clearly,
to the extent that like your software just becomes a playground for agents, I think it opens up the possibility for that to be pure usage, because the positive benefit of subscriptions is predictability and like it's simple. Agents don't give a shit if it's simple. Like they can make real-time decisions. If you're like purely that layer, I would guess that becomes pure usage in some form. I would say the layer where humans are actually interacting, I think the dominant model, at least for the next couple of years, is going to be hybrid. You know, in my head, I'm like a value purist. I think it's very rare that a business's true value is mapped to the number of people who have access to it. That's a dangerous game to play because, you know, we're talking about companies being smaller and smaller. What that's really just saying is that your maximum value of your software is going to be quite low. I think the truth is you got to have a mix, a hybridized one. It's very rare software that can charge like Bloomberg Terminal, like $20K per person per year. That's like very little software can do that. I think in reality, it's going to be this hybrid mess. And I think B2C, the way I like to think about it is B2C opts for consumption because you don't want to ask the consumer to make a purchase decision that often. You want them to like kind of autonomically like purchase and then move on with their life. You know, sometimes you're like, why isn't Netflix usage-based? And I'm like, well, because that would basically require that like every time a customer logs in to go watch something, they have to like make a purchase decision. That's like a too much cognitive load. So for B2C, I think subscription is great. B to SMB, I would say it's going to be a hybrid. And then enterprise, I think will just become closer to pure usage because basically a scaling fee that grows with your headcount is kind of like incentive disaligned with like most CFOs. But then secondarily, the good thing about large enterprise deployments is you can kind of do quite a long like POC process to kind of right size the value. Like one of the most interesting things that we see with agentic pricing is these agentic pricing that sells to large enterprises. What they'll do is they'll use the POC period to essentially run like a mini McKinsey case study, where at the end of it, they're like, cool, look, this metric that we said we'd push down, it's down 27%. That 27% means you get to reduce headcount by X%, and we're going to charge you a percentage of that. And essentially what they're doing is they're using the POC to essentially right-size the spend for them. And that kind of complex pricing is really only available in the enterprise. And so I think that's like the larger enterprises where like the more exotic, weird pricing, outcome-based pricing is going to really take off.
It seems like AI is taking over everything.
Exactly. Like I think AI kind of turns software into infrastructure for agents. Who cares what the UI or whatever of Slack is? Actually, Slack is just like a messaging protocol that connects these different things. The value of the agent is how many messages it can send down the wire.
Okay, so let's go back to this theoretical CEO. So let's say that you're trying to change your org to get ready for this sort of thing. Are you seeing any emerging patterns, or do you have any emerging recommendations when it comes to actual roles?
One of my favorite conversations is to talk to companies about their pricing council. My main thing is like, you don't want a pricing council, you want a pricing dictator. You want someone who is telling you what the right pricing is. And that doesn't mean that they don't have their like junta of people like telling them like what their view of revenue or finance or whatever. But you do need a centralized authority for kind of like hammering this stuff through. Because what I can tell you is, you know, I've seen enough of these like transitions. The sales team doesn't want to be retrained. The sales team doesn't want to have to rethink their comp plans. Like that's just like fundamentally that's friction to them. And if you don't do that work and you don't have a really strong central player who can kind of ramrod this stuff through and have a vision for it, then what happens is this stuff kind of stalls out. And so what will happen is the CEO and the board might be totally aligned, like here's what we got to go do. And then they say, okay, cool, pricing council, make this happen. The challenge is that you have to make changes. You have to make compromises across at least 3 different boundaries. You have to make a compromise between what the field wants to and knows how to sell and like literally your technical architecture for properly counting and like actually selling that thing, like actually pricing the thing. You need to make compromises between that and like actually how you recognize revenue. And so because these, in some sense, the office of CFO, the office of the CPO, the office of the CRO all have slightly different objective functions, if you don't have that centralized power who can kind of make changes that cross-cut, what ends up happening is this stuff just devolves into like business transformation hell, and pricing decisions sit on the sidelines. And then the other thing that's happening is your competition is moving really, really quickly. You can't sit on this stuff for quarters and years. It used to be like the rule of thumb was you don't change your fundamental pricing model more than once every 5 years. Agentforce, like literally Salesforce, one of the biggest companies in the world, changes fundamental pricing structure 3 times in the past 12 months. Now, that's like insane to me. Like, I don't know how they retrain their sales team, and maybe it's going well, maybe it's not. But the point is that some of the largest companies in the world are moving at historical speeds. And so if you're the one sitting there, startups on the one hand are kind of like cannibalizing or rewriting your market, and you're sitting on a pricing change that you're going to sit and you're going to do a 9-month case study and then roll it out after 6 to 9 months, you're going to be like a year and a half behind. And by the time you even go live, your pricing model is going to be outmoded. And I think that's just like a really challenging position to be as a CEO. So you really do need that central force and that kind of that will to kind of like hard deadlines are actually your friend here. Otherwise, like you're going to find that there's a million reasons why this should not happen in your organization.
To that point, where are we in this industry shift? Is it still very early? Are we in the middle, or is it already kind of late? Like if you're not thinking about this, are you behind?
I definitely think you're behind because you just inserted an insanely expensive line item into your bottom line in the form of AI. And and if your CFO isn't screaming at you now, then probably either the AI is useless for you, which, okay, interesting, or you're not paying attention to your like cogs. And so you have to be engaging with it. Now, the beautiful thing about this moment is no one knows. There's no right answer at this moment. I think of like pricing models as kind of Darwinian. We've entered a moment where like fundamentally like the ice caps have melted and it's really unclear what's going to be optimal for this new climate. And so you see a ton of exploration. You even see exploration within, take a large company, take a Salesforce. Behind the scenes, they have their like list price. They have like 1,000 variants in production, trying different things out, looking for the one that's going to stick and drive the like positive flywheel. And so you're in the exploration phase, but you got to get ready. You got to kind of retool yourself to be in exploration mode versus optimization mode. Basically, sometimes people are like, what's the right pricing model? And I'm like, that's a category error. Like, there is no right pricing model. The only thing I know is agility is the only thing that's rewarded in this environment.
One thing that I've seen emerge is, especially kind of product-led companies, they're almost using the pricing as a strategic weapon to decide between like distribution and margin. And they dial it up and down, which for me is very interesting because there's this old adage, which is like, you can never increase price.
Yeah.
It's like, you couldn't do that. And so you're always like, just do the highest price, don't worry about distribution. But now I see it all the time. Like companies are literally just like giving away a whole bunch. And so can you talk to, is that a bad idea? The old adage is that you can't increase price, does that still exist? Like, how have things shifted? Because for me, this is very, very new.
It is very new.
And it seems to be very effective, by the way.
I think a lot of things are happening at once, but I think the fundamental nice thing about Silicon Valley in this moment is that the value is literally changing week over week. If you're built on top of one of these fundamental LLMs, a month ago, you couldn't offer
you just increase the price when you have a better
right?
model.
And so you just call it a product launch and you increase the price. So for me, that's really interesting. Actually, one of the things that's really fascinating is you'll see companies that are actually, their pricing model is like a cost plus model in this moment, where basically they just fix their margin and then they basically say, look, we're going to be fixed at 20% margin. And you're like, well, that's a horrible business. Well, it's not a horrible business if what your goal is to get complete ubiquity across the market and then do some kind of much more refined pricing and packaging so that you can kind of increase your margin over time. And what they're just betting on is A, the market is huge and growing really fast. B, by preserving a fixed margin, they basically have enough capital to keep funding the next layer or next generation of models and stuff. And then that also just puts a ton of pressure on their competitors who don't have bottomless coffers. And that's the other thing that I would just say right now, is that fundamentally, you think about pricing and value as like, that's how you evaluate public companies. But for a lot of these private companies, you kind of have to understand that the truth is that if they are correct and the market is as big as they think it is going to be, that means the market is going to 10x in the next couple years. And so fundamentally, they're using capital as a weapon to kill competitors, to gain market share, and they'll figure it out down the line. And I think that's like, honestly, it's a pretty good bet in this moment. I mean, the winners seem to be truly winning hard. And it's like you see this weird thing where the companies that are at the top are somehow accelerating. It's like actually it feels like a true exponential.
It feels like, I'll tell you, it feels like the early internet where brand moats work because the markets are so large. And so you have a leader, and as soon as they're a category leader, it seems it breaks Pareto. They get 80% of the market. And we saw this in image, we saw this in speech, we've seen this in language models, we've seen this in code models, we've seen it in code editors. And so the internet went this way as well, right? You have 10 online shopping companies, one becomes the brand leader. And just because it's growing so quickly, it's what comes to mind. I don't think we've actually seen dynamics like this in 30 years.
The thing that I, kind of get from talking to the experts, the people who've been in here since the whole time, is that the level of dynamism, obviously the product layer, it's obvious, but the same thing is happening in terms of market dynamics, competitive dynamics, spend, and so the thing I would just say is that it truly is wild. And then the other thing is we're also riding these deprecation curves of cost too. I think the play of saturating market seems really, really smart. In some sense, that to me is a positive argument for preserving the subscription part, because subscription is simple. Subscription is basic. And I think that's actually why a lot of the AI companies initially went to market with that. Now that they understand their cost dynamics a little bit and the market seems a little more forgiving, they're kind of hybridizing a little bit. But I also do see people using price and packaging as a way of competing in the market and kind of being look, we can offer this in this novel way. And I think to your point about brand, that is saying something to the consumer. That is establishing a brand that we're playing for the same team. And I think the smart companies are using that.
It's hard for me not to draw parallels to the internet. With the internet, marginal cost of distribution goes to zero. You have all this blow up, and it all felt very similar. The one big difference is we didn't know how to monetize the internet. Yeah. And so at this time, it's almost like, the same level of growth, but actually we figured out how to monetize it. And it seems to me, and just chat, whether keep me honest here, it seems to me that usage-based approaches are fundamental to that monetization strategy. So it's almost like it's just kind of fundamental to this AI wave.
Yeah, yes. The way I think about it is if you're selling software, you are selling, let's say that you're ultimately selling to a CFO, whoever bottom line it is. That CFO, their number one expense item is headcount probably. Their number two is AWS, which is usage-based. So they have had 15 plus years to figure out how to manage costs in a variable cost world. Whereas in the internet, back in the early parts of the internet, usage would have been unthinkable because no one understood how to even think about or conceive it.
We didn't even know how to monetize.
Oh, exactly.
Remember,
exactly.
We basically ended up with ads, which is doesn't help anybody.
No, exactly.
Except for maybe one company.
Exactly.
In any era. Yeah.
Exactly right. And I think now we have all these technologies. And then the other thing is that AWS, Snowflake, Databricks, these companies have socialized us to the idea of variable valuable, variable spend. And I think that is it's actually becoming, it's very easy to say, this is value aligned to you. Actually, I literally, as I was driving down here, I saw that Intercom, they have this Fin product, which is an AI agent, and it does auto resolution of things, an auto resolution of customer support. They're cool, we have benchmarked this, industry standard is 65% resolution of things. Awesome. That means you get to not have a huge support team, and it's charged in a resolution-based way. And then they went a kicker, and then to the brand building, they're look, if you use this in production for, I think it's 12 weeks, and your resolution rate is below 65%, we'll pay you $1 million. We'll give you $1 million of spend back. And that's the kind of thing that's that's a huge bet for that company. That's a B to SMB business. If they're able to sell that message to hundreds of thousands, millions of small businesses, that means that those businesses are ready for usage, which I think historically has been the argument for why usage is too complex. I just think that the world has complexified and now everyone kind of gets it. And in the agent world, agents actually don't care about complexity; they just care about optimal price, and so that they're gonna favor that kind of model.
So, do you think it's fair to say, start of a new super cycle, or we're in a new super cycle?
Yep.
This is just SaaS changed the billing model. This changes the billing model, and that billing model is more central and strategic to the business than we've ever seen before. And so if anybody is in this wave, they should really be thinking about how they use usage-based billing to their advantage.
How do you architect your business around that process? And I think the example for the engineers who are listening, I think that's really telling. At most companies, let's say you had like a key database query and you found a way to make it 50% more efficient. You would just ship that overnight. You'd get like a promotion to become a principal engineer tomorrow, right? At a company that's a usage-based company, take like a Snowflake, that engineer is not allowed to ship that optimization. Why? Because basically, if you decrease the cost of computation by 50% overnight, suddenly your revenue on your like one of two, compute and storage drop by 50%. Now it may be cleaner revenue and it's probably better for the business and the customers in the long term, but you actually have to like think about that. Like that engineer has direct control over revenue in that scenario. So what do? They meter it out over a quarter. They like make it 10% this quarter, 10%, and blah, blah, blah. That fundamental way of thinking about the world is fundamentally quite different than seat subscription. And so I think all the AI companies kind of get it natively. Like they're just like, yeah, of course I'm pricing this way. It's like the only way that makes any sense. I think the where we see the most kind of hesitancy or education is in those companies that are pretty big. Maybe they have hundreds of millions in ARR and they're trying to think about how do I make the transition? And that's where I would say like really think carefully about how you're constructing your data and your team and who's empowered to kind of make sure you make the transition, because it's not as simple as just like picking a new like pricing model. Like actually it kind of requires you to think fundamental aspects of every part of your business.